So these, I know you guys are just giving me them views. I appreciate it. Where am I on my thing? Here we go. I haven't been to Veggie Girl in a while. I should go there. It's been a little bit. They had this they had this bowl that I bought, or I got. It was I think it was called a Farmer's Bowl or something. It was really good. I don't know if they still have it. It was like a seasonal thing. I ordered that thing like almost every day for like a week because it was so good. No, I told her about it though. That's the place we went, right? That we almost didn't get in because it was like all reserved. I was telling her about that place though. I said we should go. Yeah, I like that place a lot. I was telling her. Yeah, that fancy place. Okay. Yeah, yeah. Ooh, you're gonna do some raiding? Alright, man. Thanks for popping in. Have fun raiding. I'll get to a point when my gear is good enough to go raiding. Eventually. Eventually. If I stop wasting my time. Let's just say I'm taking my time. Let me just hit up a few people. Okay. So I think we can go ahead and just sort of do a recap, get started. Let's see here. Make sure I hit the right thing. Yay! Okay. Oh, I should probably keep it full screen. Oh, goody. Let me do it this way. Hold on one second. Oh, it's too big now. Oh. Let's do it like this. There we go. That works. Okay. So, welcome to our hour of code for learning to program with Python. This is geared towards anyone who has no experience with programming whatsoever. It's a very quick sort of live stream. We're gonna do it kind of piece by piece, really hit on some concepts and like take the time to kind of discuss some of the fundamentals, not jumping too quick to you know, confuse and rattle people. So our first stream was was on Tuesday. That was our first stream. We went through a few things. So we'll just do a recap. We talked about why programming is great, but also why you should be interested in programming, whether you're looking to do it as a career or whether you're looking to do programming as a side thing for fun, to build a little project that you had to help you with something that you were doing. We talked about a lot of those things, and it's really important to really, discuss this because it's one thing to just kind of get into it, just because you see it might have some potential for a career, but also just getting excited about it, getting motivated. I think if you don't have that foundation of being motivated to learn, you're just gonna pick it up and just kind of throw it away. We also talked about why Python. Python's a very, very powerful language, and it's being used by big companies. You can have a career doing strictly Python. Not only that, it's very, very diverse. You can use this in many different fields. It's being used in tons of different pathways. So it's very, very useful, but at the same time, it's a great language to start learning because there are some concepts that you can pick up, and it's kind of easy to get into, and it could sort of be that gateway for you to get into different languages because again, a programming language is just your tool. It's not. It's just something to help you get something accomplished, and not one programming language is like the best programming language. It depends on what you're doing. But it's a really good language to help you understand other ones too, so learning the core concepts. We talked about, discussing what interests you. We've got some stuff about like, oh, I want to move into the dev department at my work. Another is I was interested in AR. There's a lot of like different things, and you can already see the diversity where one person might be interested in doing one thing and another person might be interested in another thing. So we discussed a lot about the interests, and that's one thing I still challenge you continually as you learn. You may not know it right now, and that's fine. If you don't know what you want to do yet, that's totally okay. It takes a little bit of research to understand what is possible and what in particular interests you. We also talked about failing is learning. Just like almost any other skill, there's gonna be moments where you're gonna struggle, whether it be in sports, whether it be programming, musical instrument. You're gonna have to go through the motions, and you're gonna mess up, and you're gonna struggle, and you're gonna hit those sort of brick walls, I like to say, of learning, and that's totally okay. I encourage you to really struggle with that and really hit those mental hurdles, because it's sort of like an exercise for your brain. It forces you to do research and to understand why something's not working the way you want it to, or why you can't hit that sort of understanding. So I highly encourage, if you fail, take a day, watch Netflix, go do something else, go have fun, come back to it, and when you break through that hurdle, that's like the best feeling, is when you can break through that hurdle. We also just talked about setup. Pretty easy to install Python. Go check my other VOD out if you haven't. I have it posted on my YouTube. I can always message you if you don't have the link for that. I have the VODs up. I'm trying to get them kicked out and like condensed down and kicked out every other day. Also, I'm looking to do this pretty consistently. So Tuesdays and Thursdays, 5 p.m. Pacific, or if you're in Mountain Time, it's 6 p.m. Just an hour. We're gonna make it really quick, get it done, get it good. I know everyone's busy, and I want people to use this time as just a way they can kind of get into it. We talked a little bit about Python version 2 and Python version 3. As a learner, it doesn't matter which one you learn. Yes, 3 is newer, and yes, things are moving towards 3, but don't feel like you can't have it on 2. Like MacBooks, for instance, like I said in the last VOD, MacBooks have Python 2.7 installed. So if you don't want to have to go through the installation, you can always just go through that. And I'll probably make a separate video on how to like get everything installed. But the last VOD, I did the installation for Windows. So if you have a Windows computer, just check out the last VOD. We talked about calculations, how you can use Python as like a calculator. Of course, that it can do much more than that, but getting an understanding of the interpreter and understanding how Python can be used in almost like the simplest of ways. We also talked about printing. Since we're using the console a lot, printing is a great way to just It's one of the core features in Python. We can just use it to sort of look at data, and data was another key concept that we had in Python. And we ended on the basics of variables. So what does a variable, what does it mean? What is it? We're gonna get a little bit more into that today. So don't worry about that. We'll kind of discuss more about that. All right, so let's do sort of the recap on variables. We discussed variables in good detail in the last VOD, but it's basically a way to store your data in Python. It's something that stores a piece of data. And one thing that I mentioned was that your variable, or whatever the name is, isn't the value that it is. So to kind of go back to kind of like talk about variables one more time. This one. So let's go into Python. So we talked about creating a variable. We can say like test is equal to 3. So this assignment operator, this equals, is saying I want to create a variable called test, and it's going to point to the value 3. And one thing that I heavily iterated on was the concept of test is not 3. Test is pointing to 3. And the reason I hit on that really hard was because if I type print test, it's going to print the value 3. However, I can reassign test to something like 5, and now test is no longer 3, it's 5. So the concept is pretty much that test is a name that we've reserved in Python to say that it's pointing to a certain value that we can use. So going back to the notes, if we have a new value, then this variable name is now pointing to that new value. So that was sort of the recap of variables, and we talked a little bit that like why do you need variables? Variables are very key in programming because if you're gonna, a lot of programming is you're taking some type of input, you're manipulating it, and you're providing some type of output. Whether it be for a user or for some sort of backend, you're taking that value and you're taking some sort of input or multiple inputs and you're doing something with it. And in this case, variables, it's very important to have variables stored because if you're doing calculations, if you're storing like a description or like a username or anything like that, those are all things that need to be stored somewhere. So one thing I didn't touch on yet, which I want to touch on now, is variable names. So in the example that I did, I used test, which was suitable for just that example. But how do you name your variables? What is a variable name? And in most cases, I guess a good example is, I said test is 3. What does that even mean? That doesn't mean anything to anybody in context. Or if I said monk, like, the variable name equals the string monk. It doesn't mean anything. Like to another programmer that might be reading your code, or to you, if you go back and you're writing, you're programming and you go back, you need to understand what that variable is. So a variable name is just, it's something that matches that data, So for instance, if you're storing a username string, you probably want that variable name to be called username, right? However, there are a few rules to how you name your variables in Python. So things that aren't allowed are keywords, and I'll get into a little bit more about keywords in a bit, but keywords are pretty much words that are already used in Python. For example, in our previous VOD, we talked a little bit about Booleans and how there's the concept of true and false. So we can't make a variable called true because then we're trying to override something in Python that we don't want to override. We don't want to mess with some of the internal workings within the programming language itself. So there are a few keywords that are kind of like no-nos to use for variable names. We can't use symbols except for the underscore, which that is a special case. But we don't want to use like the $sign, we don't want to use ampersand, we don't want to use special symbols in our variable names. And our variable names must start with like one of the letters of the alphabet. Meaning we can't use like we can't start with a number, but we can use numbers in the variable name. So we'll kind of go through some examples on which, like what will work and what won't work. So let me go back. Okay. So things that would not work. If we said one name equals must, we'll see that we're gonna get this syntax error. So Python's basically spitting back at us and saying, whoa, like you can't do this. This isn't allowed. We can't do something like this. Same thing. We don't want to use any specific symbols, so we're gonna get another error. And in both these cases, we got what's known as a syntax error. So syntax is essentially the rules of how you program in Python. It's how the code is supposed to be laid out. So when we get a syntax error, that just means, hey, you're going against the rules for writing this stuff in Python. You're not allowed to do that. Another thing we can't do is say class equals, like, if you want to say computer science. We can't do this either. Why? Because class is another keyword that's specific to Python. And we will get into classes later on, not now. But I'll just say that is not allowed either. So as you can see, and just know that these errors, they're there for a reason. You know, they're there because if we can't do something, we would rather have our system tell us we can't do it than to say, oh, everything's okay, and then when we try to run the program, it just breaks. Okay. All right. Hello, Ali. Thanks for popping in. So I want to quickly go into something. I don't want to delve too much into it, but this is sort of like a programming practice. And it's good to kind of discuss it now because we're going to be writing variables, so it's good to know about this. So in programming overall, our goal isn't we don't want to obfuscate anything. And when I say obfuscate, that basically means I don't want to make my program confusing. Like, I don't want to make the code confusing because I'm going to be the one that needs to read it later on if I need to figure out how to do something. So it doesn't make any sense to try to be confusing, right? I don't want to name random variables things that aren't what they are. I don't want to do all this stuff because that just doesn't make sense. Especially in the workplace when you work with other programmers and you guys are working together on the same code base, you don't want to be confusing. So naming your variables is actually really important because it helps you understand what is going on. And we'll discuss a little bit more as we create a little dummy example. So there's two sort of conventions of how you can name your variables. And when I say by like naming the variable, I mean how you kind of, variables are just like, in a way, short descriptions of what they are. Like username or password when I say those things, you already kind of know what that thing is going to be. It's going to be a username. It's going to be a password. So there's two types of programming. There's more, but these are the two that are most commonly used. One is called camelCase. And by camelCase, it just means every word that's in your variable. So you start the word off with a lowercase, in this case, my. And then every word after this is going to have a capital at the beginning of the word. This helps you understand or be able to read the variable name and understand what it is much easier, rather than having everything lowercase. It's kind of hard to understand. So in this case, it's my name or hello world. This is known as camelCase, where every word after the first word has a capital. The other convention you can use is snakecase. And what snakecase just means is you're separating every word with an underscore. My name and hello world. Generally with Python specifically, this actually varies from programming language and even just the user or the programmer. So some people may prefer one way versus another, or some people might just switch around and kind of do two different things. Overall, you want to use the same sort of convention, at least in your project, whatever your project you're working on. In most cases for Python, you want to use snakecase. I know that sounds kind of like, well, duh, it's snake case and Python, but it just makes the code a little bit more readable, because you can, it's easier to see immediately this is my name, versus here it's a little bit more scrunched together. I don't want to get too much into that, but I'm just, for you as a user, go ahead and just pick one and just play around with it and see kind of what you prefer. And again, one isn't like better than the other, it's just a preference thing. But it's very important to kind of stick to one, because it makes your code overall more readable and understandable to other people. Okay. So I want to kind of go back a little bit to something that we talked about in our previous stream. That is, let me just clear this out so you guys can see. That is the, I talked a lot about, being able to use something like this print statement. We talked about, assigning variables. These commands that I'm typing out, we want to call this something just so we have a convention of how we're discussing everything, and we want to call this expressions. And expressions is basically just this. It's a line of code almost. Whether we use it like an operator, whether we say C equals 1 plus 1, and we have C, these are just expressions. They're just things that we're doing in code and in Python. Okay, so I just wanted to touch on that. So if I say expressions, that's what I mean. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit going back to data types. I know I'm going through this pretty quickly, but I want to just kind of go quickly, but then every now and again in the stream, I'm just going to kind of reiterate it just to make it easier to kind of pick up. So previously, let's go back to here. Okay, so previously we talked about data types, and we used this command type to see what the data type is. So if I see what the type of this hello world is, you'll see it outputs that it's a class, which we'll talk more about later, but it's a str or a string. So we talked about strings as being a set of characters. This could be a description on a website. This could be chat on Twitch. This could be your username. This could be any of those things. It's just a set of characters. We also have type of a number, and in which case we get an int back, or integer. Or if we have a more precise number, that's a float, which is just a decimal number. And last, well, there's more than this, but the last one we talked about last time was the concept of like true and false, which is a type Boolean, or bool for short. So we talked a little bit about a bunch of these things, but we didn't go and talk much into detail about anything else. So going back, there's one thing we can do called type conversions. And that's the idea of like, what if I have something but I want to convert it to something else? And this is useful because, you know, if you have a string that is, the string is, like I said, it's a set of characters, but what if that string is like 1, 2, 3, 4, but you want to do some type of math on it? You can't do math straight up on a string and get the right value back. And that's where type conversions come in. So we can take these types and convert them to different types. And Python allows you to do this in most cases as long as it can. So what I mean by that is if I try to turn this, so we know 3.1415 is a float, but what if I wanted to convert it to an integer? In which case I can wrap it in this command int and turn it into the integer 3. And we'll get a little bit more into like specific stuff of like why is it 3 versus, you know, whatever, but you know, we want an integer is a whole number, so it brings it down to a 3. Same thing if I try to convert a integer into a more precise number, like a float, it's going to go and turn into 3.0. Same thing with the string. If I turn that into an integer, it's going to convert that. But if I try to convert this 99 problems and I turn that into an integer, it's not going to work. So if I just go back. So like I said, if I convert, what was it, an integer to 3.1415, I'm going to get back the value 3. If I convert 3, I'm going to get 3.0. If I try to convert 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm going to get back the integer 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's a very important thing to discern because the string that I passed in, 1, 2, 3, 4, I can't do math on that. I can do math on this. And last, if I try to convert something that it can't convert for you, it's going to give me an error. And in this case, I'm getting a value error back, which basically just means, hey, you gave me something I don't even know how to turn into an integer. Like, I can't turn that into an integer. And you might be asking, like, you know, what's the use of this? You know, one big use case for this is sometimes you're going to get a value and you need to do some type of math, or you need to print it, or you need to have it be displayed somewhere. You got to make sure that it's using the specific type in order to do the right calculation. In which case, you know, if you're going to do a very precise calculation, you want to make sure you're using a float and not an integer because you want more precision. Same thing if you're going to try to print something in chat or like on a website or whatever, you're going to want to make sure that it's coming out as a string. All right. And we'll show an example of like how I'm using type conversion in a very, very dummy way. Okay. So let me go back. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. And again, if there are any questions, just like holler out in chat. I'll be more than happy to kind of like take a pause, especially if you don't understand something. And that's the point of me doing the live stream, is you guys can interact and have questions. So if you do have questions, feel free. Okay. Sorry, I just had to clean up my mug real quick while I put some coffee in there. Okay. So that is not what I wanted. That is in a second. So let's go through some more example, or let's go through that example that we were discussing. So if I go back to here. So I want to show another command that's available in Python that you can use. And in this case, this command is called input. So I can use this input to take a user input. So say we're building something and then we want the user to type in something. In a lot of cases, you've seen this in, like, say, a website, if you want them to enter their username and password, or if you're building something very specific and you want them to enter some information in order to do something that fits their needs. So I can type that, and what it's going to do is it's going to print out what I have within this input. So it prints out that string, kind of like what we saw before, but now I can actually type something in here. And if I type that, it kind of gets cut, or it kind of combines with my message. But you'll see that it's printing out that blah, 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 blah when I typed it. Now, I can take that value and store it in a string, or store it in a variable, excuse me. So I can take a variable, so I can say user input equals input, and I could say, what would you like to type? And in this case, I'm just going to put a space because I know it's going to kind of mix in here. So if I type enter, now it's going to say, what would you like to type? And you've probably seen this before. If you ran a program on like a terminal or a command line, you probably have seen something where you have to type something in, or even if you know, in a more kind of like well UI designed case, websites, you know, or even like logging into Steam, that kind of stuff, you have specific text boxes that are asking you for input. So I can type something like, hello mom, and hello world. And now, when I type that in, you notice I didn't get a printout back from Python. But if I print user input, you'll see that I get that value back. So now we've taken what the user has given us. In this case, it's still me, but we've taken that user input and stored it in a variable, which we can then manipulate or, you know, print back out. And another cool thing we can do is, say I want to print out in more detail what happened. I can say print the user has typed. And what's great about strings is I can add strings together, and adding strings are just like placing the string and then putting the string right after this one. So I can say user input, and now I can say, now it will say the user has typed hello mom and hello world. And I can just make this a little bit more readable. So I can do something like this. So what I did here was I had this string that I kind of put in, but then I also took the variable that we took from the input and sort of added it together to, you know, sort of print back out. So that's input. It's a very, it's just another Python function, and we'll talk more about functions. I don't know if we can go through that today, but we can talk about that in the next stream. But yeah, so let's kind of discuss how we would do something like a tax calculator. Something that just computes sales tax, right? It's a very dumb example, but it's something that I think kind of hits on a lot of these things we were talking about. So let's think about the calculating sales tax. It's pretty simple. You take your subtotal, whatever the thing costs, and then you multiply it by 1 point and then whatever the sales tax is. Right? So if it's like 9%, it's like 1.09. So obviously we use a calculator for this stuff, and it's not something that you're gonna do, but it's a good way to sort of pick up an understanding of how you can use Python to build out some of these things. So let's think about what we need. We need an input because we don't know how much the subtotal is gonna be. So let's take a variable that we're gonna use as an input from the user that's a subtotal. Also whatever the state tax is, and then we're going to store all that in a total variable that's gonna have the total. And then we're just gonna print it out. So let's kind of like clear this out and then we'll go through that. So I can make a variable called subtotal. And here I can say subtotal equals input. What is the cost of the item, right? So when I hit enter, let's just say it's $19.95. That's how much our thing costs. Hit enter. Now I have that stored. Now let's store the state tax as another variable. In this case, I live in California, so I think the state tax is like 9.75% or something like that. So I can say state tax is equal to, and I want to multiply it by 1 because I want the total to still remain there. So 1.0975. I believe that's correct. So that's my state tax. So now I have two variables that I can use. I have the variable subtotal, which is the subtotal cost of whatever the item is, and I have a state tax variable that I stored. So now I can calculate the total, right? Well, before we do that, let's think real quick about, so I typed 1995 here, but let's see what type the subtotal is. So if I type on the subtotal and I look at it, you'll notice that I got a string. And if I just type subtotal just to print into the interpreter to see what it is, you'll notice that I'm getting a string back. I'm not getting a float back or the decimal float that we were expecting. Why? Because the input takes whatever the user's inputting, and the user can input any set of characters. I could have inputted QWERTY for all I wanted to, and it could have just given me, so it's giving me just a string back. So remember we talked earlier about type conversion. This is where type conversion can come in handy. So again, if I type float on the subtotal, now when I print it out, the quotations are gone and it's no longer a string. Okay. So now what I can do is in my calculation, I can make a new variable called total and do float subtotal multiplied by the state tax. And now if I print out the total, I get 21.89. If you try, so if I try to do subtotal times state tax here without the type conversion of a float, you'll notice I got a type error. And it says can't multiply sequence by non-int of type float. Basically that just means, hey, I don't know how to multiply this because it's a string. So we had to use the float type conversion to convert it. So we converted the user's input to a float. Now granted, if I try to do this and my subtotal was like a bunch of characters, it's going to error. But we'll talk later more about error handling, which is a very important concept in programming, which is we can't always expect the user to give us the perfect data, right? I can type the wrong thing. And a good example of that is if you go and you try to log in on a website and you just type random characters or the wrong password, you're gonna get back an error message that says there's no account here. That is what the programmer did to handle the case where you didn't give them the correct information. So now I can go back and print and do a similar print where I said your total for today is plus, so I can add the strings together. And in this case, I want to add the total, but the total is remember, the total is a float, so I can do the same type conversion. So string total. And here's one other important thing with when you're programming these statements is you want to make sure that you have the right parentheses throughout the entire thing. So a good way to check that is count how many lefts you have to how many rights you have. So you have 1, 2, 1, 2. So you're covering all bases. It can be something that as a beginner can be very confusing. Sometimes you might accidentally forget that last parentheses, and if you hit enter, you're gonna see something like this, where Python is expecting you to do something because you're not completed out yet. So, you know, you might hit enter and you'll be like, what's happening? The reason is because with Python, you can type things on multiple lines. So you can type things on multiple lines, and therefore it's kind of expecting more stuff. So technically, if I wanted to, I can add more to the string like this, and when I close it out, you'll see that this gets added on. And the reason, again, is because when I printed, it's technically taking all this as my print statement within the parentheses. Just letting you know to make sure you look and make sure you close all your parentheses where they need to be closed. So going back to this, I can do print your total for today is string. So I gotta convert my total to a string, and I get the total for today is 21.89 blah 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 blah. So you can see how even in a simple thing like calculating the tax from an input, we're already using things that we talked about. We're using type conversions. We're using these expressions that we've discussed earlier, like printing and input. And this is a very, very trivial, basic example, but it's very important that you understand some of these basic pieces, because it can be one of those things where if you don't really know what's happening, it's very easy to just get confused and get lost. Okay. So let's go back. So we talked about type conversions and sort of its role and how you can convert things to the right data types in order to perform the right functionality. All right, the last thing I want to go over is if I can find my notes. I'm gonna go into the basics of what's known as a function. I'm gonna touch on it for now, but we're already kind of hitting our hour mark pretty closely, so I don't want to go too much into it. But let's just go in and kind of discuss a little bit about functions. So functions, like variables, are another key component in programming. It's very, very key. And the definition of a function is purely just a chunk of code that performs a specific action. So pretty much it's just these lines of code, like all these pieces of code that are that perform a very specific action. You put that as a function, and I'll discuss a little bit more about that. So let's look at the anatomy of a function real quick. So the first thing that we have is we have this def, or define, def for short. This is a Python keyword. So before, remember how I was talking about keywords in Python and how you can't override these specific keywords. Def is one of those specific keywords. You cannot override that. And what this is doing is this is telling Python, all right, I want to create a function. So this name of function is, again, like a variable. You want to have a name that's clear and concise and that it explains what your code is doing or what your code contains. So an example would be going back to signing in or logging into something like Facebook or Twitch or a service. A very basic example is if you type a username in, you want to authenticate that username, right? You want to make sure that the username is a real user and it's not some fake user. You want to make sure that it's the correct string that's getting put in. So you might have something like authenticate user as a function name, something that explains what it's doing. And if you think about it, if you look at what the name is, authenticate user, what is it? It's a function that has specific code or a chunk of code in there that will authenticate that user. And then you'll have a parentheses. And you've seen us use parentheses before, right? That's because print is a function. The print command, the input command, the type command that we've used are functions. Those are examples of functions, and you've already used them. So you have this parentheses, and within these parentheses, you can have any amount of inputs that you need. And I'll explain more about this. And they're known as parameters. I'll explain more about parameters. And then in here, you'll notice that there is this print hello world. In this case, this function is useless. We don't even need it, but it explains what I'm kind of talking about. Oh, before I go back to this print, at the end of the parentheses, you'll notice that I have this colon here. And this colon is actually really important because this colon basically defines, it sets up our function. It tells Python, all right, all the code below here that's indented is going to be part of me as a function. And I'll explain more about this. I know it might be confusing, so I'll kind of give a better explanation. And in here, you notice, like I said, there's an indentation here. This isn't like a mess up. This is specifically indented. That's because Python is space aware in a sense for the text. Meaning that as long as you have a specific amount of spacing in here, it belongs in this function. I'm doing a terrible job explaining this, but I promise I'll go through more of it. But think of it this way. Think of the tab here, this tab, as anything that's tabbed in is going to be a part of this function. So let's do this as an example, right? So what I can do is I can go in and say def print hello world. So say I'm gonna be printing hello world a lot and I want to have this somewhere. Actually, before I'm still on this, let me go through one big thing about why we wanted to use functions. Let me actually discuss that real quick, because we're gonna discuss this. So again, generally you want to have 4 spaces on anything that's going to be within this function. Any code that you're going to write to be a part of this function, you're going to want this to be indented in with a tab or 4 spaces. So, okay. So why do we need functions? Well, A big thing in coding, again, a lot of programming is you want things to be clear and concise, but you want it to be simple. You might hear this a lot, but programmers are actually lazy. And the reason I say that we're lazy is because we want to do things as easy as possible or in as little work as possible. So there's a principle in programming known as don't repeat yourself, or the dry principle. And it's a basic strategy for reducing the complexity to manageable units. And what that actually means is if you were to write a very complex system or code, you don't want to just write every single line just going through, you know, this does this, this does this. Because if you go back to that, say you write 100 lines of code to do something, right? Say you write 100 lines of code to authenticate the user to get into your website or your system. What happens if you need to, you know, authenticate the user again at some point? Which happens a lot. Like, say you're changing a very key piece of information on the profile, you want to re-authenticate it to make sure that, you know, like, they didn't leave their login on the computer and forget or something like that. Well, you don't want to write another 100 lines of code or copy and paste that, right? Because the problem is it's going to get confusing. It's going to get really confusing. So the point of functions is to take those chunks of code and make it reusable. So your goal in building these functions is to make it reusable for all the times you use it, or even if you're going to use it, build it for someone else, they can reuse it. So we'll discuss more about that. Just have that in the back of your brain. Don't repeat yourself. Like, you don't have to understand sort of the core everything. Just understand, don't repeat yourself. Okay. So if I go back into my screen, and I was typing this and I didn't know we were in the right context. But, so say I'm gonna have something that prints hello world. Very, very, very basic example. I'm gonna type def space print underscore hello underscore world. And in this case, I'm just gonna have empty parentheses because I don't need any input yet. I don't have any specific input. And remember, we need this colon here because that colon now tells Python everything below this is going to be a function as long as it's indented. So if I hit enter, you'll notice we'll get this similar ... That's because Python is waiting for more input for us. And in this case, Python's saying, all right, you've told me you want to make a function, but you need some code in there. And in this case, I'm just going to put 4 spaces. And just as like a preference, like you don't have to use like exactly 4 spaces. You can use 2, you can use 8. But the key thing is they have to have the same amount of spaces for all the code that's in your function. So in this case, I'm just going to type print hello world here. And I'm going to type enter. And it's still waiting for more input because, again, it could be multiple lines. But in this case, I'm done here. So if I hit enter one more time, you'll notice nothing happens, right? You'll see that hello world didn't print out. That's because I created the function. Now, similar to when we use the print, I can say print hello world with no parentheses, or with nothing in the parentheses, excuse me. And if I hit enter, you'll notice that it printed hello world. So by doing this here, what is actually happening is it's going into the system and saying, oh yeah, you do have a function called print hello world. I'm just going to run all the code that's in that function. Okay? That's a very, very key piece here. Now, I can just use this wherever I want and I can just call it and it works. Awesome. I have a function that is kind of useless, but it explains my concept of functions. Now, what if I type just like some random thing and I try to do this? You'll notice I get an error. Name random function is not defined. That's because I didn't create a function called random function. So it doesn't work. Now what happens if I make another function, right? Similar to how we created the other one. But this time, I don't put the spaces. What will happen? I'm gonna get an indentation error, which is expected an indentation block. Again, because Python uses the blocks or uses the spaces to understand what's in what. And to explain that a little bit more, I'll just write in this text editor here. Say let's make that function again, right? Same function that I had before, right? But say right after here, I do this. What will happen if I call this print hello world? What's gonna happen? It's going to print hello world, yes, but it's not going to print hello mom. Because again, like I said, anything that's blocked in or indented in here will run. This is just gonna run whenever I run this code. This isn't gonna run, or this isn't gonna run with this print hello world. And that's a very key thing to think about. You may have seen this in other programming languages where, you know, they have like print hello world, and then they use these curly brackets, right? And then they have more code in here that runs. Well, these curly brackets confine that code into the function. In Python, they don't have these. Therefore, you need some way to tell Python, hey, all this stuff is within a function. So remember this. This is very important. So again, we have our keyword def or define, the name of our function and what it does. In our case, our function is doing exactly what it says it's going to do. And any potential parameters. So let me talk about the parameters too, because that's also a very good thing. So what if I want to print hello world, but then also the name, like my name, right? I could just type in my name, but what if I want this function to be used by other people? So they could put their name in. Like what if they're typing their name in and it kind of pops up and it says, hello, your name. Right? How do I pass data into this function to do things? Well, that's pretty simple. I can just put the name of a variable in my parameter in the parentheses. So in this case, I can just say name. And in here, similar to how we've combined strings together, I can say hello world space, because we want a space in there, plus the name. Now in this function, Python knows that there should be a name coming through, or a variable called name. So this name right here is a variable and it should come through. So let me actually define this in here. So I'm going to redefine it. So print hello world. And this time I'm going to add name in here. And again, remember, you need to tab through or 4 spaces. Print hello world space and plus name. All right. So now I've redefined this function to take in a name. So let's try to do this without putting anything in. And you'll notice when I tried to do what I did before, I'm going to get a type error and it's going to say, yeah, dude, you're missing a required argument. You need to have a name. So in this case, I can say print hello world, and now I can provide a name. And now when I do it, it adds the name in there for me. Yes, you can. You definitely can override functions in Python. So like, you don't have to have just like, you can have multiple like functions and take in different positionals. Sorry, 1 second. No problem, no problem. Yeah, if you have any questions, like, feel free to just go ahead and just type them out and ask. But, sorry, I actually lied. Overriding functions. You can overload methods for classes. Sorry, I should restate that. You can overload methods in Python within classes. So, which is a topic I'm going to get into later when we get into classes. But yeah, you can override methods within Python. Yes. So going back to the indentation, this is actually what makes Python. Some people might find this annoying, but I find it actually really nice. Is by forcing you to use spaces rather than, you know, by forcing you to use spaces as like this indentation for a function, what's great about this is it kind of forces your code to look cleaner, and it also removes some of the potential things that like people can forget. An example would be in something like C or C++, or in Swift, since I'm mostly remember Swift right now, you would have to do something like this, and you would have to have these curly brackets, and then in some programming languages you need a semicolon at the end. So if you have like var or like name or your variable, excuse me, equals data value, you might need like a semicolon after it. So you can see that this allows you to sort of clean up the code, and it creates these enforcements that allow you to just kind of the code to remain consistent, especially amongst other people's, like if you look at Python code from other programmers, it kind of forces this consistency, which is, some people don't like that because they prefer to code their own way. But once you get into the hang of what's happening, it's a very useful thing. So going back to our like calculate sales tax example, you know, you'll see that I have, let me go back to my notes real quick. So we went and we did this whole like calculating the sales tax, right? Or calculating the total with a sales tax. But, you know, I've typed all this code in here, but now I can't, like, in order for me to do this calculation again, I have to type everything back in, right? And that's a huge, huge pain because I don't want to type all that. I'm lazy, you know? So now what I can do is I can make a function for this to calculate the sales tax, right? So I can almost take all this code that I had up here. So I'm just going to show you up here in the text editor. So I can say def calculate sales tax, right? And I can say subtotal equals input. What is the cost of the item? Space end. I can type in the state tax, and since I live in California, it's 1.0975. And then here I can go in and say total equals float subtotal times state tax. So this is all the code that we just written earlier. It's all pretty, standard. However, what if I want to use that total for something? I don't just want to print it, because in our other example, we just printed, right? What if I want that total and I need it for something to be used? Like I need to use it for calculating more stuff later on. Well, there's another keyword in Python called return. And what this means is we're outputting back out some data. Similar to our input right here, when we use this input, we stored it in a variable subtotal, right? This input returns whatever we typed in. So in this case, we're returning this total. So then I can take this and I can say total equals calculate sales tax, like this, and calculate my total. But something's kind of wrong with this. Well, for one, I'm taking this input, right, as a subtotal, but I just talked about how we can use parameters to give us the input. And in some cases, I don't want the user to have to type out the total. What if I'm programming something more elaborate and I need to pass that value in without a user input? Well, this function is no longer good to me. Also, this is the state tax for California, or the sales tax for California. Well, what if I want another state? What if I'm creating something that calculates what the sales tax would be in a bunch of different states so I can decide where to purchase something from or do something like that? Well, this function is no longer good, and it breaks that principle of not repeating ourselves, right? So what if instead I get rid of these and I pass them in as parameters, like this. And instead of this, I pass it in. Well, now, yeah, I'm taking, some of the work or some of that stuff away, which is like, isn't the point of having the function so you can put all the code in together? That's true. However, now this function becomes a whole lot more useful. Now I can use this for multiple states, and I don't need to rely just on the input. So when you build these kinds of functions, you need to really think about, is this function useful in multiple situations or scenarios? Because then you can create it and then you can just use it wherever you need to, right? So now I can say calculate sales tax, 1995 and 1.0975 like I did before, that. But then I can also do this again for a different total, like $200, and the sales tax of 0643 for maybe another state. Now I don't need inputs every single time, and I can provide another input for the state tax. So I've just and you can see I don't need to run this calculation every single time, or I don't need to write this code out for both of these, both times. And if I do this 100 times, that's even better, right? So now you can see sort of the how useful creating these kinds of functions are, and not just creating functions, creating good, well put together functions. I know I just went very simple into this whole bit. That's the end for this hour of code. It's already been an hour. Again, my goal here is to take my time in helping you understand some stuff that if you're a complete beginner, it'll help you understand this a little bit more. And that's my goal. Again, this is only my second live stream. I hope that I can help improve myself to help kind of teach some of these concepts to you guys. Our next session will go more into functions. We'll kind of go back and do a recap on functions, just so we can reiterate some of these things and help it kind of get ingrained. We'll also go into modules. So we'll start talking about modules and the actual usefulness of Python modules. And we will...
Now we aren't strangers, are we?
Oh, thanks again thanks for the follow, Black Moon. I appreciate it. Also, my other thing is I want to understand what you guys want out of this, or what you guys are looking to get out of just like programming if you're new. I also want to know your like expertise level, if you're just a beginner or if you've programmed in other languages before, and what your motivation is. So Black Moon, I would love to know what your like expertise is, and it seems like you do have some knowledge in programming because you're talking about, you know, overload and overriding, so I assume you have some knowledge there, whether you're just looking to learn Python and stuff. And I agree with you. I think the best way to learn yourself is to teach. Like, there's been so many times where I like think I know something, and then when I try to teach it, I learn in the whole process. So my goal is to okay. So you've done some web programming. Okay, so you know Java and C. Yeah, so I'm sure a lot of what I'm talking about is like extremely basic for you. But I mean, I do appreciate you coming in, and if you are curious about Python too, like, oh nice, Haskell. Yeah, I haven't used Haskell before. I've used Python for like 4 or 5 years, and then I've also, yeah, I agree. No, I agree, and it's also Python, so I think you might find that useful in web too. You can always use Python for web stuff as well, so it could kind of help you in the same line. So that's great, and it's helping me too. I'm kind of building things as I go, and one thing that I understand is, you know, us as programmers, it's very easy to assume something's really easy. Like talking about variables, as soon as I try to break it down like even more to like a very basic level, I realized how confusing it can be as like a total beginner. So it forced me to really understand like how to explain like even the concepts of variables and functions even, because they are things that can get really confusing, especially if you don't have that programmer mindset yet. But yeah, my goal is to take things slow. I want to keep things consistent every Tuesday and Thursday, 5 p.m. Pacific, just an hour. We're just going to do an hour of code. We're going to go through Python. We're going to, you know, ramp it up as we go through as well. So we'll go through more things as we go on. But I do want to like go through these basics, but I don't want to go through the basics like so slow that you get bored. I just want to like hover over the basics, but I want to like hit at it really hard. But I don't want to go through every little thing. Like I don't want to talk about every single thing about a string, because it's just not useful until you start understanding the other aspects. So I want to kind of go roundabout and do that. So yeah, thank you again for the follow. I really appreciate it. We'll do some more hour code again every Tuesday and Thursday. I'll create a VOD for this. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you for popping in and you know, tuning in. I really appreciate it. I hope to see you some more. Thank you again. We'll continue just kind of like going through, like I said, we're gonna go through modules. We're going to go through the Python standard library, so how you can do some pretty sweet things in Python without using just what Python provides you. We're going to go through some of that, and then we're going to eventually get to the point where we start creating our own functions, like how to play like a basic game of blackjack, that kind of stuff, and see how we can utilize what we're learning to creating something that's more than trivial. So thank you guys. I really appreciate it. And I will see you guys on Tuesday.